So hi, thank you so much for having me today. It's really, really brilliant to be here. It's great that there's such an awesome crowd. And I'm genuinely privileged that I'm being included in such an amazing lineup of other thinkers that I really admire and artists whose work is really exhilarating and exciting and just genuinely really interesting. So, okay, am I too tall? So today I'm going to be approaching this topic of the inhuman through the technological or the machinic. So categories that are often involved in this kind of boundary work around shoring up what the human is and means. I particularly want to think about some of the ways in which this perceived boundary between the human and the machine can be troubled by the category of woman. And more specifically, the relationship between cis women, various kinds of technologies, and the social institution of work. So over the course of the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to suggest that labour, which has conventionally been coded as feminine, is now being delegated with increasing frequency to machines. And I'm going to attempt to trace some of the potential economic and cultural outcomes of this process. Okay, so the first thing I kind of want to note to kind of kick off is that the histories of machines, femininity, and waged labour have long been understood as deeply entangled and mutually constitutive. And this is kind of quite neatly illustrated by a number of vintage adverts for hardware and software, for example. So I'm just going to show you a couple. This was the best I could get of this image, but it's actually a much bigger one. So when Alice leaves, will she take your billing system with her? And Alice is a pregnant woman. The photo is her smiling with all of her baby shower gifts. And the suggestion is that she's going to take off and all your accounting system is going to fall to shit because, she's so unreliable. And then a series of kind of related ideas here. All of these adverts are from the 60s. This one here, our optical reader can do anything your key punch operators do. Well, almost. It can't take maternity leave, or suffer from morning sickness, or complain about being tired all the time. But it can read. And this one here, it can't make time on company time, or use the office for intimate tete-a-tetes, or be a social butterfly. So, your workplace technologies can't get pregnant, they can't flirt, they can't misbehave on your time. And then the last two, this one here for an automated telephone service, which is, you've got the boss there offering it flowers because he's in love with his electronic secretary. And this one here, which is again for these optical readers, it's got what has 16 legs, 8 waggly tongues, and costs you at least $40,000 a year. Of course, it's women, pesky women, turning up, doing work, not being machines, annoying everybody in the process. Okay, so these adverts point to the trouble with female employees, their errant embodiment, their capacity to distract and be distracted, and their irritating habits of sociability and maternity. They also point towards the idea of the clerical worker, who is typically represented as white, cisgendered, and middle class, not to mention female, as an unsophisticated device for saving male managerial labour. A device that is liable for upgrading and replacement by newly available office technologies. In these adverts, the new technological apparatus assumes, often in quite literal ways, the position of the secretary. Technology becomes her. And this merging of women, machine, and work is taken in a new direction in the 21st century with the advent of the digital assistant. So digital assistants are basically knowledge navigators, which are available as part of various operating systems and which recognise natural speech and use this ability to help answer users' queries and to aid in organisational tasks such as scheduling meetings or setting reminders. So perhaps the most obvious example of this is Apple's Siri. So she's now widely recognised as being the voice of the iPhone. But there are several others that do the same kind of thing. So you've got something like Google Now or Microsoft's Cortana, which all kind of perform the same kinds of functions with varying degrees of efficiency. The connections between these digital assistants and the conventions of low-status clerical work are obvious. Microsoft went so far as to interview human PAs whilst developing Cortana. And in 2011, a reviewer from Wired magazine declared that using Siri is, quote, kind of like having the unpaid intern of my dreams at my beck and call, organising my life for me. So these apps represent, in many respects, the automation of what has traditionally been deemed women's labour. And this association with so-called feminized labour, the sort of the clerical and the service work, is of course further emphasised by the gender markers that are attached to these apps. So whilst there are various kind of voice settings available for these devices, including this sort of like a much overlooked man-bot version of Siri that nobody uses, these digital assistants are usually advertised with female voices. And they are often referred to as she in consumer reviews or technology blogs and in marketing materials. So you might not be able to see that well. This is an advert that I saw popping up on the tube in London quite a lot for Cortana, this digital assistant from Microsoft. And it says, meet Cortana. She not only learns and remembers what you like, she can also provide reminders based on your location and contacts. All you have to do is ask. So, you know, it's very obvious that Cortana is a she, and they're really emphasising that she is a she here. On the one hand, we can view this gendering of the digital assistant as being very much on a par with wider trends in the contemporary sonic landscape. As Nina Power has pointed out, the contemporary city environment in particular is full of often pre-recorded, disembodied, sometimes rather robotic, recognisably or attributably female voices. So we hear them on urban transport systems, you know, telling us what the next stop is. And then we hear them at the self-checkout facilities at supermarkets and reminding you to, you know, take your receipt, and so on and so forth, these disembodied robot lady voices. Power calls this ubiquitous oral tick the logical vocal daughter of the switchboard operator, and points to a negative correlation between the sort of rise of these recordings of female voices and the representation or recognition of actual women's interests in the public sphere. In other words, her work suggests that there is a tension between different ideas of what it means for a woman's voice to be heard. The literal and overheard fembot voice versus an under-listened to political voice. Indeed, the entanglement of disembodied female voices with issues of exclusion or underrepresentation may be more direct than Power suggests here. Some commentators have claimed that the use of female voices in, for example, navigation devices dates back to World War II, when women's voices were employed in airplane cockpits because they stood out amongst the male pilots. So women's voices have historically been used to issue instructions precisely because women themselves have not been around to be heard. In some ways, to point out that digital assistants are gendered is to make a very obvious kind of point. Many of us are aware that Siri, for example, is feminized, and many of us are likely already acclimatized to the gendering of virtual service work. So this was from my recent experience chatting online with my bank, and I just had to pull this up because they've got this question here: how would you rate that person in taking a genuine interest in you as an individual? So it's not enough that my chat helper kind of provides me with a service. She's got to care about me deeply. So in an earlier discussion of this earlier generation of virtual assistants, specifically customer service bots on early noughties websites, the critic Eva Gustafsson notes a demonstrable preference for feminized avatars. She dismisses this as the unreflecting result of an ambition to mimic circumstances in offline service realities. Help bots are portrayed as young and female, in other words, because customer service workers in general are young and female. However, she also makes some pertinent comments about the role of expectation here. Comments that kind of work to foreground the notion of so-called feminized labour. Gustafsson suggests that the preference for this kind of gendered avatar is rooted in the stereotyped image of women as being, by nature, more suited for service work and emotional labour than men are. She also claims that, and this is the quote up here, the stereotyped image of female service providers has its basis in the stereotyped image of female qualities. Such a stereotypical female image of caring, empathy, and altruistic behaviour has become a standard component in a service script. In this account, service work is positioned as feminized labour, and service bots become fembots, not simply because women make up the majority of the workforce, but because the image of the sector is itself feminized. That is, it is associated with qualities traditionally coded as feminine. Indeed, this is not just true of customer service. Many contemporary understandings of feminized labour gesture towards trends in the global labour market that can be linked to the dominance of a socially gendered skill set. And this is kind of a compelling but quite problematic idea that I'm going to be revisiting in further detail as this discussion progresses. Both service work and clerical work, then, have conventionally been designated as female or feminine. And this distinctive gendered history has arguably been part of the reason for the prevalence of feminized digital assistants. We are witnessing the protocols of femininity being programmed into machines as feminized labour becomes technologized labour. Many of us are at home with the idea of women in these kinds of roles, and as such think nothing of it when we encounter technological interfaces that are clearly coded as female. But it is important to remember that the presence of these feminine machine voices, their proliferation to the point of near cultural invisibility, was never a foregone conclusion. So, in fact, when we look back to the earliest moments in the development of these technologies, we encounter very different ideas about how best to program them. So the company behind the original Siri app, for example, seriously debated the possibility of using a gender-neutral voice, whatever that might sound like, whilst Apple's early visions of knowledge navigation systems sounded very different from the digital assistants that we know today. So I just want to show you a little bit of speculative corporate advertising from the late 80s, for example, which looks forward to 2009 in order to imagine this intelligent digital assistant of the future.
Research team in Guatemala, just checking in. Robert Jordan, a second semester junior, requesting a second extension on his term paper. And your mother reminding you about your father's
surprise birthday party next Sunday.
Today you have a faculty lunch at 12 o'clock. You need to take Kathy to the airport by 2. You have a lecture at 4:15 on deforestation in the Amazon rainforest.
Right. Let me see the lecture notes from last semester. No, that's not enough. I need to review more recent literature. Pull up all the new articles I haven't read yet.
Journal articles only?
Mm-hmm, fine.
Your friend Jill Gilbert has published an article about deforestation in the Amazon and its effects on rainfall in the sub-Sahara. It also covers drought's effect on food production in Africa and increasing imports of food.
Contact Jill.
I'm sorry, she's not available right now. I left a message that you had called.
Okay. Let's see. There's an article about 5 years ago, Dr. Flemson or something. He really disagreed with the direction of Jill's research.
John Fleming of Uppsala University. He published in the Journal of Earth Science of July 20 of 2006.
Yes, that's it. He was challenging Jill's projection of the amount of carbon dioxide being released to the atmosphere through deforestation. I'd like to recheck his figures.
Here is the rate of deforestation he predicted.
Mm-hmm. And what happened? He was really off. Give me the university research network. Show only universities with geography nodes. Show Brazil.
That should kind of give you some of the idea about that. And then I just want to show you this little last bit of the ad.
Print this article before I go.
Now printing.
Okay, I'm going to lunch now. If Kathy calls, tell her I'll be there at 2 o'clock. Also, find out if I can set up a meeting tomorrow morning with, Conley.
Enjoy your lunch. Hello, Professor Bradford is away at the moment. Would you like to leave a message?
Michael, this is your mother. I know that you're there. I'm just calling to remind you to call your...
So hopefully you could hear like most of that. It starts with him coming into work, and there's a message from his mother that he skips over, and then he has this little handy proto-Siri who helps him through all of his daily work challenges. So, of course, obviously, the digital assistant here is given a male voice and avatar, and is also, not coincidentally, I would argue, professionalised as a research assistant, academic librarian, and information manager, rather than just as a personal secretary. So it even features that kind of classic signifier of nerdy expertise, which is the bow tie. So you can tell that this is a serious man with a big brain, even though he is also a technology. And this masculinized software is shown performing some clerical and organizational work, but the shift in emphasis between this vision of a 21st century workplace technology and today's more multimodal knowledge navigators is clear. Whilst Siri, Cortana, and Google Now are marketed as tools for both personal organisation and interpersonal connection, so in adverts we see them doing stuff like, oh, call my wife for me, send this message for me, can you tell me that whether that person is the person that I think it is, and all this kind of stuff. In this vision, the 1987 Apple Knowledge Navigator is flagged up as a protective barrier between the male professor and the domestic sphere. Indeed, whilst the digital assistant here has both a masculine voice and a male visage, we encounter an early spectre of the contemporary regendered Siri lurking in the form of the disembodied mother. This is the lone voice from the forgotten space of social reproduction, which surfaces in the form of messages and reminders about a surprise family birthday party. Fortunately, the digital assistant catches and screens these messages, better allowing the human male professional to repeatedly ignore them and to get on with the real work of being a genius. The mother and all that is associated with her remains literally obscene in the sense of being off the scene for the duration of the commercial. What is clear, though, is the continuing affinity between woman and machine. The mother here, in calling to issue reminders, prompts, and guidance, performs functions aligned with those of the high-tech Apple software. Yet somehow, whilst Proto-Siri is an example of human mastery over knowledge, the professor's mother is little more than an annoyance to be managed. So this is one under-recognised element of Siri's genealogy, or genealogies rather. The phone call making mother, just as much as the switchboard operator, the workplace secretary, and the customer service bot, is part of the digital assistant mix. But to recognise this raises a number of issues. First of all, it is important to emphasise that the boundaries between the spheres of production and reproduction are not at all clear-cut. As materialist feminists have long been aware, the traditional caregiving activities associated with domesticity are part and parcel of preparing the body and the mind of the wage labourer for work. This may extend to things like personal organisation, moral support, and even preparing documents. And conversely, the duties that have fallen to the traditional secretary bleed into those associated with social reproduction. And the personal assistant frequently finds him or herself conducting a form of corporatised care work. And this includes providing for the sustenance of the body in the form of teas and coffees and lunch orders, as well as stuff like making dentist appointments, picking up dry cleaning, paying personal bills, and so on. Indeed, in his classic sort of mid-50s study, White Collar, the American Middle Classes, C. Wright Mills characterises the senior personal secretary as follows. She is the mature woman, efficient in her job, suppressing her love for her married boss, to whom she makes herself indispensable, doing the housework of his business. So it's interesting to note then that many of the ads for digital assistants show them performing the kind of personal services commonly associated with the hybridized figure of the office wife. Work at this kind of impossible to maintain non-boundary between production and social reproduction, waged labour and care work. So we see the technologies flagging up birthdays and anniversaries, for example, or reminding the male user to buy flowers. Emotional labour that was once amongst a certain class of the privileged, outsourced to both secretaries and wives, is now outsourced to the electronic device. And this brings me on to the topic of hyperemployment. So what do I mean by this term, hyperemployment? Well, it's an idea advanced by Ian Bogost, which links contemporary technological developments with a qualitative and quantitative change in personal workloads. So Bogost's argument is that technology, far from acting in a labour-saving capacity, is in fact generative of ever more tasks and responsibilities. So I've got a quote here which sums this up quite nicely. It's a long one, you'll have to forgive me. So Bogost writes, "It's easy to see email as unwelcome obligations, but too rarely do we take that obligation to its logical, if obvious, conclusion. Those obligations are increasingly akin to another job, or better, many other jobs. For those of us lucky enough to be employed, we're really hyper-employed. committed to our usual jobs and many other jobs as well. It goes without saying that we're not being paid for these jobs, but pay is almost beside the point, because the real cost of hyperemployment is time. We are all doing those things others aren't doing, instead of all the things we are competent at doing. And if we fail to do them, whether through active resistance or simple overwhelm, we alone suffer for it. The schedules don't get made, the paperwork doesn't get mailed, the proposals don't get printed, and on and on. So Bogost is talking about all the unremunerated labour we are now obliged to take on ourselves, which other people once performed for pay. So in some ways, this is a comment about the redistribution of clerical labour in the face of downsizing, cuts, or profit maximisation for organisations, as well as increased workloads and suppressed pay for administrators. Activities that were once within the remit of specialised roles have now been spread across a wider spectrum of the population as various services have been dismantled. And to be clear, Bogost's discussion encompasses not just workplace email, but many other kinds of technologically mediated tasks as well. From electronic time cards and expense reports, to any online communication and organisation we might need to perform for our families, to the mundane micro-labour associated with user-generated content for sites like Facebook and Twitter. So when we take our own blood pressure at the doctor's, or when we issue our own books at the library, or when we check out our own groceries, when we perform any of these newly individualised tasks, which would once have been undertaken by paid workers, all of this testifies to the state of hyperemployment. And as such, we can be hyperemployed even if we are out of work. And indeed, the amount of form filling, appointment organising, and self-assessment required from job seekers in the UK suggests that it is hard to be unemployed without also being in a constant state of hyperemployment. Despite the range of Bogost's discussion, though, it is the spectre of contemporary waged labour which looms largest over his analysis. So this is reflected by Bogost's insistence that, quote, we work increasingly hard for increasingly little, only to come home to catch up on the work we can't manage to work on at work. Waged labour, in the form of actual paid work or in the form of the dynamics of paid work, is infiltrating the home. Work is weighing heavily on the work-life balance, and information and communication technologies are increasingly enabling us to take the office with us wherever we go, or better put, preventing us from leaving the office wherever we go. And the feminist Christina Marini similarly gestures towards this idea, pointing to the home office or the domestication of work, which delineates the new home landscape of work. So this is the quote up here. Private life and working life are combined inside domestic spaces, and the two environments are mutually transformed into hybrids. Does the house expand to encompass working arrangements themselves, she asks, or conversely, does work invade an intimate and protected area? So these comments are very telling, I think, because they point to one of the limitations of this idea of hyperemployment. It appears as if Bogost is assuming the existence of distinct spheres here, with the sphere of production sullying and encroaching upon the sphere of reproduction. For various reasons, however, this distinction, the existence of which is asserted in this implicit account of its breaching, does not hold. Because for some, the home has long been experienced as a place of work, namely for working class women, minority ethnic women, and economically disenfranchised women. And the home is also well established as a site of labour for women who are in full-time employment. The home is not so much a protected area, as Marini suggests, as an additional workplace and the backdrop of an unwaged second or third or fourth or nth shift. The concept of hyperemployment extends beyond social media and email and is really a form of housework and maintenance for our daily lives. As Karen Gregory notes, the arrangement between digital technologies, data economies, and invisible labour, calling it employment, runs the danger of sidestepping the deeper, gendered and racialised antagonisms inherent in the distinction between what is considered labour and what is considered care. Indeed, perhaps what Bogost is drawing attention to has less to do with employment than with the uneven redistribution and privatisation of the labour of social reproduction, an antagonism that feminist theorists have been kind of thrashing out for over 30 years. It's worth noting, I think, that a lot of the work that Bogost refers to when outlining this idea of hyperemployment is labour that we might traditionally think of as being performed by wives and mothers, a certain subset of whom may well, as a result of the shift in gendered labour patterns, now be engaged in waged labour outside of the home when in previous eras they might not have been. Yeah, this image is taken from a Japanese government publication called Innovate 25, where they are trying to encourage an increasingly robotic lifestyle amongst their citizens. And I just found it rather entertaining. Of course, for those who can afford it, some second shift work can be outsourced and offloaded onto paid employees. Many elements of housework and care work have not been technologised, but merely redistributed on the shoulders of different subjects through its commercialisation and globalisation. As the participation of women in waged work in the global north has increased, a portion of housework has been marketised and displaced onto low-paid workers, often women from the south and from former socialist countries. The figures of the non-native cleaner and the foreign nanny kind of exemplify this. We cannot forget, though, that the globalisation of domestic labour only shifts a feminist problem from one demographic to another, and can in no sense be said to kind of mitigate the underlying issue. However, we must also note that some elements of second shift work evidently have been technologised. Certain elements of certain activities can, under our supervision and with our input, be partially delegated to devices. In Robin James's words, what the idea of hyperemployment points to isn't a new phenomenon so much as a reconfiguration of an ongoing practice. Our smartphones wake us up, not our moms, just as emails accomplish a lot of the relational work, scheduling, reminding, checking in, etc., conventionally performed by women. So again, this stresses that the home has never been sacrosanct. It has always been a workplace for many, but the work that has been performed there has been largely invisible. And I just find it really interesting that this disappeared labour is being made visible at the precise historical moment that some women are doing less of it. It is no longer being framed as social reproduction, but as hyperemployment, a term that really emphasises its onerous and often unwelcome character, as well as the sense of relentlessness that can adhere to the basic maintenance of our everyday lives. Of course, the fact that some women may now be doing less of some elements of this work is exactly the point. These various obligations and micro-tasks have been transformed into work because technologies are now performing them rather than women. When the knowledge navigator issues a reminder, it's akin to useful work. When your mother issues a reminder, it is bothersome nagging. And this work was largely invisible until machines took it over. So why might this be the case? Does digital technology re-signify the gendered stigma conventionally attached to care work, affective work, and other sorts of feminized work that never quite count as real labour. Well, of course, the first thing to note is that the individualisation of this labour has redistributed basic life maintenance across different segments of the population. When I suggest that technologised processes are more likely to be recognised as work than feminised reproductive labour, I am of course downplaying the fact that human beings are the ones programming and managing electronic devices. But we have to set the alarm clock, input that reminder, and so on. So it may be that we are culturally more alert to the value of these activities, now that different kinds of people are more likely to be involved with them. The gender political implications of this are obvious, I think. It is telling that Bogost frames hyperemployment as a troubling encroachment on people's lives, rather than as a levelling of the playing field. The other point to make about this, though, relates to the cultural framing of so-called women's work, and the various obstacles that are thrown up by the social imaginary in terms of recognising reproductive labour as effortful, purposive, and valuable. Work performed by gendered subjects in the home, particularly within cultural fantasies of a heteronormative family dynamic, has been naturalised. That is to say, it has historically been framed as an extension of naturally occurring feminine, and often quite specifically maternal, predilections, affects, modes of intimacy, personal preferences, and so on. Indeed, this is something that Kathy Weeks picks up on when she declares that, quote, to the extent that the expression of emotion has not only been feminised, but in the process also naturalised as a spontaneous eruption rather than a cultivated display, the skills involved in managing it successfully remain difficult to grasp. That is to say, these skills remain invisible as work, both within the home and within the workplace. Although emotion work lends itself particularly easily to the cultural erasure of effort, we can see the same processes in operation when it comes to things like housework as well. So this idea of kind of a feminine tendency to be house-proud or to have like really exacting standards takes what Angela Davis calls the obstinate primitiveness of household labour and then repackages it as this sort of simple idea of a woman's touch, where you go into the home and it's like some kind of sequence from Disney where you float around and some squirrels help you and suddenly the home is transformed. The functions and activities performed by electronic devices are of course less available for naturalisation, and as such their usefulness and necessity are less likely to be obscured via the same means. Hence, in the examples we've looked at, machines become more visible as workers than women. Whilst it may be somewhat galling to be confronted with the fact that the activities of Siri, Cortana, and so on are more readily available to be recognised as work than similar activities performed by feminised human subjects, this may still afford interesting opportunities in terms of the progressive degendering of work. In Katie Waldman's words, as shiny, trendy devices absorb some of the jobs we once delegated to lower status humans, these jobs, still unpaid, have at least begun to shed stigma. As feminised work becomes technologised work, then, it may come to be less culturally denigrated and therefore more available to be taken up by different kinds of subjects. Those with choice and cultural capital, in other words, may be more willing to perform this labour if it is associated with culturally valued objects rather than socially denigrated subjects. An extremely partial victory, of course, given that it assumes that the only way to dislodge stigma is to remove any association with embodied women and those related to their sex class. So that this whole kind of phenomenon is less a matter of that famous kind of feminist slogan, I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess, and more a case of I'd rather be an iPhone than a woman. Now, I want to kind of round off this paper by situating some of the ideas that we've been talking about today within the wider context of debates about women and work. It seems to me that both the recent regendering of the digital assistant and emerging male recognition of hyperemployment both invite us to revisit and reconsider one of the more dominant trends in theorising the workforce, namely the so-called feminization of labour, this idea that's kind of been lurking at the margins a little bit in what I'm talking about. So, as we've seen, the term feminized labour is used to define not only the objective aspect of the quantitative increase in the active female population around the world, but also to underline the qualitative and constituent character of this phenomenon. It refers to new trends in the administration of labour, such as precarity, mobility, and low salaries, and it refers to the dominance of new types of working behaviours under late capitalism, including an emphasis on relationship building, emotional connection, communication work, and the propensity for care. So hence my banking chat assistant asking me if I felt recognised as a fully human subject. Indeed, Marini suggests that both the form and the content of so-called feminised labour draw on the baggage of female experience. That's the way that she phrases it. Women are viewed as being well prepared for the demands of precarity and for the insistence that workers be flexible, consistently available, and dedicated to jobs whose working patterns may be unpredictable. And this is the result, Marini suggests, of a female tendency to transfer the modalities and logistics of care work, particularly in the context of the mother-child relationship, which practically does not have limits of time and dedication, and to make them part of the person's professional work. Now, the limits of this argument are immediately obvious, I think. So the tendency to put the mother-child relationship at the heart of the lives of those who don't have any children necessarily, as well as the seeming implication that there is only one possible model of maternity and child rearing, and that is dyadic, it's privatised, and it is all-consuming. Although Marini's discussion is far more delicate and far more insightful than these sort of specific comments might suggest, it is important to acknowledge that this argument risks naturalising and homogenising what it is and means to be a woman. And this, indeed, is one of the issues with labelling changing trends in the character of labour as feminisation. There has never really been a single female or feminine experience of work, given the myriad ways in which intersecting forms of oppression, such as race, class, and able-bodiedness, have affected the scope of women's opportunities and their ability to either enter or withdraw from the labour force. To label any shifts as feminisation is to foreground a particular narrative of how women work and have worked, which subsumes all difference beneath a single banner of gender. We should not forget, of course, that when we speak of these late capitalist trends, we speak also of a distinctive racialisation of work, amongst other things. What's more, to call these contemporary tendencies and processes feminisation is to assume the existence of a strict two-sphere model of the social world: production and reproduction, masculine male and feminine female. And this is sort of hinted at in Bogost's analysis of hyperemployment. In implying a breaching or mingling of spheres in this way, the feminisation of labour posits a radical differentiation between men's and women's work, at the very moment that this supposed separation is compromised. This risks not only homogenising, but also essentialising and reifying particular ways of doing gender. As Paul B. Preciado so astutely points out, nothing allows us to claim that the new post-Fordist model of work is more feminine than the industrial model was. Is it possible that women didn't work as slaves in the cotton fields? Is it possible that they weren't the first to pick sardines on an assembly line, or work in the textile industry, or manufacture smart cards for Microsoft? Saying feminine to describe the progressive casualisation of work implies a presupposed heterocentricity, a metaphysics of sexual difference, and the precondition of a rhetoric of gender, according to which sure, stable, and permanent implies industrial and male, and flexible, changeable, mobile, and precarious implies post-industrial and female. To label certain forms of work as feminized, then, risks perpetuating the idea of a stable and ongoing gendered dynamic to wage labour under cognitive capitalism, at a time when the stability of gender itself is increasingly being called into question. In the process of staging a contamination, in other words, it asserts a gender purity, albeit one from which we have already been alienated. The future terms of engagement around ideas such as emotion, touch, intimacy, sex, care in all its forms are restricted by their funneling into existing gendered paradigms. Indeed, this destabilisation of gender is something Marini herself vaguely gestures towards when she declares that, under contemporary social conditions, the simple and binary dichotomies of production, reproduction, male work, female work, lose their meaning to the point of pushing us to hypothesise a gradual process of the degendering of work. And again, this assumes that dichotomies once had a stable meaning, but the notion of degendering may nonetheless remain a more useful figuration than the feminisation of labour. Okay, so I am just wrapping up now, I promise. I can see some anxiety at the front. So in addition to this, describing changes in labour practices as feminisation also suggests that women bear some kind of responsibility for facilitating the rollout of generalised precarity. More of certain kinds of women have entered the workforce, and around the same time, waged work itself has become more feminine. It is easy to view this as a cause and effect dynamic. Just as when women form a reserve army of labour, they are seen as somehow implicated in the kind of downward pressure on wages. Women's changing role in the workforce, then, has, this notion of feminisation seems to imply, normalised women's conditions and foisted women's exploitation on the rest of us. So, in Power's words, when people talk about the feminisation of labour, their discourse is often double-edged. The phrase is at once descriptive. Work is generally more precarious and communications-based, as women's jobs have tended to be in the past, and an expression of resentment. Women have stolen proper men's jobs. It's their fault, somehow, that we don't have any proper industry anymore. So I think this set of implications is a further reason to be very wary of the feminisation of labour as a concept and as a catchphrase, and it's also a reason to insist upon a set of caveats and qualifications whenever we might be tempted to use this term. The challenge is to acknowledge the important histories of women's labour patterns without turning women into a monolith, without discounting differently gendered forms of feminised work, and without providing further discursive supports for the idea of a binary gender system marked by inherently feminine or masculine practices and abilities. And this is no mean feat, of course, and something that I've been sort of wrestling with throughout this paper. In this discussion, then, we have examined the shift of reproductive labour from women to machines and have gestured towards some of the effects this might bring about. This includes the appearance of hyperemployment for men and the denaturalisation of affective and reproductive labour, effects which are neatly exemplified by the figure of the digital assistant that we've been talking about. We have also noted the continued prevalence of gendered assumptions in the ongoing critical discussions around feminised labour, and remarked upon some of the ways in which these assumptions might work to shore up ideas about an immutable two-spheres model of the social and economic world. So I want to finish, though, I've got 2 more paragraphs here, by suggesting that it is perhaps in terms of destabilising some of the assumptions at the heart of the feminisation of labour that the automation of clerical, service and care work can be considered most interesting or productive. This process of automation arguably troubles the idea of an innately feminine skill set or perceived causal links between particular bodies and particular social roles or attributes. It is clear that many of today's apps and automated systems draw upon pre-existing gendered assumptions, programmed as they are to be girlish avatars or feminized disembodied voices. This is Anna, IKEA's help bot. They exploit our assumptions about feminized labour and our existing relationship to socially gendered caring and service behaviours, tapping into those elements of femininity that have historically enabled caregiving or service-providing subjects to better undertake specific obligations, activities, or tasks. So far, so unhelpful from a feminist point of view. However, the technological uptake of femininity and the automation of what was once coded as women's work can also be seen to denaturalise those gendered, socially expedient, and culturally programmed caring behaviours that are frequently brought under the banner of femininity. In acknowledging that our devices or apps have to be actively programmed in order to mimic specific gendered behaviours, in recognising that their feminisation is neither neutral nor inevitable, but the byproduct of specific histories, we are invited to rethink the ways in which non-machinic gender might itself operate as an artificial and culturally programmed construct. When technologies do gender, it is obviously not natural, but is instead visible as the product of deliberate choices about how best to relate, assist, or persuade the imagined technology user. As we have seen, femininity, understood here as a particular set of gendered expectations or associations or behavioural norms, often plays a part in the developer's toolkit. This foregrounds the idea of femininity as an admittedly problematic label for a mobile set of capacities, techniques, or strategies potentially available to machine and variously gendered humans alike, thereby undermining the idea of feminine behaviours as the product of an innately sexed skill set or as a spontaneous eruption. Contemporary apps exploit ideas about gender in their attempt to offer an effective service to users. With this in mind, then, I wonder if we can position femininity as a technology that our technologies now put to use. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now it's on.
Is it on?
I would now directly open up the floor. So if there are any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And also, please don't hesitate to ask in German. We will translate it. So don't be shy to voice any thoughts.
Why do you think the gendered metaphors have been more persistent compared to racialized metaphors? Like, for example, the white gloves in cursors come from, like, are referring to, like, butlers, which is very much like referring to slave labor. So why do you think that those metaphors have kind of gone away in the 2000s and they existed in the 80s, whereas the gendered stuff has seemingly, like, intensified?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point. I mean, I think maybe some of it is about this deliberate move towards a kind of clerical work. So it's different metaphors of technological help, I guess. The moving away from the butler, because he used to have, like, that sort of Ask Jeeves idea, but even that was a white butler in this sort of a very particular image of what service work could be. And that's gradually been sort of nudged out by this idea of Siri and Cortana and Google Now as a secretary. Part of that might be the shift from sort of visual icons to oral icons, because there is the difference between a male and a female voice is supposed to be very clear, and it's supposed to be very obvious that Siri is a woman, whereas perhaps it is a little bit more tricky to include those kind of signifiers of race in a kind of oral capacity. Maybe something like that, but it's definitely an interesting point that has been sort of invisibilized, whereas gender has been more and more kind of stressed. Because it wasn't always that, if you were going to have some kind of help working on a document, for example, that it would be gendered, because you used to have Clippy, the Microsoft paperclip, who was, that was a thing, that was an ungendered thing. And gradually that has been shoved out in favour of a more overtly kind of gendered form of service provision from our technologies. Yeah.
Thank you, that was fantastic. I've learned a lot, wonderful stuff. I have a question about what I consider as sort of slippages, but they were not, they were orchestrated, between women, femaleness, and femininity. For my generations, those were enormous issues that we took to shreds. Can you say something about how your neo-materialist sort of methodology deals with that? Because you seem to use them interchangeably.
Yeah, I was certainly trying to negotiate that at different spaces, because obviously I kind of use the idea of feminine or feminized as being an association with women or those related to their sex class. So try to create something that's suitably expansive, that it isn't just about essentialism, but something that recognises the role of gendered and sexual embodiment in the process of these ideas around femininity and feminisation. So at different points in the paper, when I was talking about different things, I was trying to use woman or female or feminine in different ways when I was referring to different kind of elements of this process, whilst acknowledging precisely what you're talking about, which is the fact that they bleed into each other and they slip into each other, and there are perceived causal links between the sexed body and innate skill sets, which are then feminized, and trying increasingly to disembed that idea that there is this inherent link, whilst respecting the fact that certain different bodies do different things. And that's sort of an ongoing challenge in my work to acknowledge that, and not to try and push away this fact that, there are certain kinds of bodies which aren't necessarily male or female, but that might be impregnatable or impregnable, and then that being a way of understanding what bodies do differently, aside from a very strict sort of binary model of sex and gender. So, but it's constantly difficult, because you catch yourself doing it. You're so trained to talk in a certain way about gender that you will find yourself, when I'm reading over my work, I'm like, oh, hold on, no, I've fallen into a trap there, and have to go back over and constantly introduce those caveats and qualifications that I was talking about in relation to feminized labour, and going back and trying to acknowledge distinctively gendered histories whilst not totalizing the idea of what it means to be a woman and what a woman's experience is.
That part is fine and it works, but to take your wonderful final sentence, femininity is a technology that our technologies now produce, which is fine. Lacan would agree with that. And that there is a femininity, masculinity script that is produced. He wouldn't have used technology, he would say culture, theatre, music. But if I replace that with femaleness, and if I said femaleness is a technology that our technologies produce, it doesn't work.
Yeah. No, that's true, because femaleness is assumed to have that undislodgeable biological root to it, whereas femininity is the projection of qualities onto bodies and what those bodies do. But you do have to kind of perpetually trouble that, because I don't think you don't have to have a body that was female at birth to be a woman. So, but at the same time, there is this greater flexibility of femininity as a concept for regendering technologies and bodies, and it's something that you can absorb. One of the things I've been really trying to negotiate with this work is in terms of how available femininity is as a technology for non-female assigned bodies. Because you see it as very distinctly used as a strategy in feminized care work performed by men. So there's been studies that have been done which show that male nurses and male teachers deliberately use femininity as a tool to get jobs done. So they talk about what they do as being maternal, as using sort of a woman's skill set. And that is seen as being this a means of accomplishing particularly socially gendered tasks more efficiently. So it's very much positioned as a technology there. But at the same time, you've got to then acknowledge that it's not a technology that's equally available to everybody. You know, there are social barriers to how and when you can take up femininity as a tool. And this is what I was worried about with the feminization of work, that it seems to reify this idea. It seems to stop different people taking it up. And I would like to try and clear the way a little bit so that as, not in the next 5 years or anything like this, but over sort of a long-term progression, we can think about dislodging these ideas of certain bodies have certain behaviours, or certain bodies can take up femininity as a technology more readily. But I'm also wary about saying that femininity is a technology because I don't want to fall into the same trap as the feminization of work. You know, because it does still have those gendered associations within it that I'm working very hard to kind of unpick or disembed by doing this kind of very carefully worded dance around things.
So we have another question here.
On doing your research on the feminized labor, did you run into, for example, a gender-neutral apps and other that was there in any way as possible, as think of as a machine without the sex part?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely is possible. I think in some ways, again, it's about this reliance on the voice and voice recognition. Because, you know, as I was saying, the original Siri app developers were like, well, we'll have a gender-neutral voice. And when I was thinking about that, I was like, how possible is it to have a gender-neutral voice? Because of the tendency to attribute gender to things. You know, it's very, how can you strip it away to the point where we can still listen to it and understand it very readily and very easily, but without there being a gender? Whereas when you just have the presentation of information, like, you know, we wouldn't assume that Google was a dude, you know, we wouldn't assume that Facebook was a man, but because it doesn't have those very explicit gender markers attached to it. So it is possible to have these devices, but the way we can do that when they are working around voice recognition and, you know, recognizing natural human speech and responding with sort of vocal cues, I'm not so sure. I think finding new ways of sort of sonic expression outside of gender is a very interesting and huge issue, I think, like how you can communicate in a gender-free way without it being very specifically a fembot or very specifically a manbot. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd be interested to see sort of what the original Siri developers were trying, you know, how they were creating this, and making it so that it was still understandable and usable, but gender-free.
Do you think that avoiding gender-neutral voices has to do with the uncanny valley? Yeah, possibly. I think in terms of developing like a usable sort of sonic-driven app, I think maybe if you stripped away gender, you would just have this very weird sort of metallic, potentially voice. But there's also this very obvious idea about persuasive robotics and the way that persuasive robotics uses gender. I think this is something that we were talking about earlier, yesterday. Because persuasive robotics have been trying to, for a long time, figure out how best to make people do things using robots. So specifically, again, this is sort of a Japanese context, having care bots that are designed to administer medicine or persuade people to do their physiotherapy when they might not want to do physiotherapy. And part of the toolkit that people are using in order to make these robots more persuasive is gender. And they're making very deliberate and particular choices about how to gender these robots to make people do things. Like, will people respond better to a female bot that is then associated with nurturing and care? And can we exploit that set of cultural ideas around gender to sort of
mobilize particular behavior sets in humans or to nudge humans to do particular things. And then again, there's also this thing around age, which I think we were discussing yesterday as well, like this tendency to make bots look young or to look sort of innocent and cute and child-friendly as a way of regulating expectations about what a robot can do. Because if you make a robot that, you know, looks like a super competent adult human, you expect, you know, we are supposedly as humans supposed to look at it and think, okay, well, this robot can do anything that a human can do. Like, this robot is a proficient adult and can be trusted to do very detailed, in-depth things. Whereas if you make the robot look childlike or look kind of innocent, then your expectations are lowered and you're like, okay, well, it can lift this thing, it can say this thing, but it's not a human, it doesn't have a human brain. So it teaches us to expect less and engage with it in a different way. So there is a gendered element in that, how you can use gender as a nudging tool to alter behaviours, which is intriguing and weird and problematic, because a lot of the time this is being done without any kind of gender political reflection about what it might mean. It's just purely like, oh, well, you know, people like women to do nurturing things, so let's make a robot that does nurturing things. You know, without then actually thinking, okay, well, what does it mean that we are perpetuating these stereotypes about what women do?
Hi. First, thank you very much. I loved your talk. And I have only a short example, which maybe feeds into the last two questions. Because in Germany, I'm not sure how it was in the English-speaking world, but in Germany, one of the first navigator systems for cars had a gender-neutral voice, Nuvi, it was called, which wasn't accepted very well, and it was changed into a femward voice shortly after. So maybe that
very
would
interesting.
Feed into your argument.
Well, you see, I heard a rumour that I didn't include as one of my examples here, at the risk of alienating my audience, which was that the German navigation systems in cars originally had a female voice, but you guys wouldn't listen to it, so they had to change it to a dude's voice. But I decided that I wouldn't bring that up. I'll just leave that.
Okay. Are there any more questions? Then, thank you very much, Helen.
Thank you. Cheers.